Good evening and welcome to the George Washington University. My name is Liesl Riddle and I'm a faculty member in the Department of International Business here at GW, and I'll be moderating tonight's event. This evening's program, Go Global to Get Ahead, Hear Practical Advice from Experts Who've Done It, is co-sponsored by GW Center for International Business Education and Research, as well as the Association of Women in International Trade. The Center for International Business Education and Research, or GW-CIBER, is funded by the U.S. Department of Education. As one of 31 competitively funded centers funded by the U.S. Department of Education, GW-CIBER's mandate is to encourage teaching, research, and outreach regarding international business. The main goal of the CIBER network is to enhance U.S. competitiveness abroad. Sponsoring events like tonight's discussion contributes to GW-CIBER's goal of encouraging international business careers. Our other co-sponsor, as I mentioned, is the Association of Women in International Trade. I'd now like to ask Barbara Linney, who is the legal counsel of the organization, to come forward to tell you a little bit about their organization. Barbara?
Thank you, Liesl, although I will say that although I am pro bono legal counsel through my firm Blank Rome, I'm here tonight primarily in my capacity as a volunteer, and it was my pleasure on behalf of WIT and through its charitable organization, charitable educational trust, to be able to help with organizing and co-sponsoring this event. WIT is the largest and one of the founding chapters of the Organization of Women in International Trade, which is a global organization of women's trade professional organizations. And I will say mostly women members, but we do welcome men, and in fact even have a few male members here in our chapter in DC, some of whom are active in the chapter as well. Here in DC, we offer programs on international trade and policy issues. We also have networking and special events at which our members can network with professionals and public and private sector experts in the trade field. And through our educational trust, we engage in a number of educational programs, including development of a trade education unit for high schools, and very recently ongoing trade education program for members of Congress and their staffers. So I hope that we do have information out at the counter out front about WIT, and I hope that some of you will consider joining us and supporting our objectives while advancing your careers. Speaking as a longtime active WIT member, over the years I've been a committee co-chair and president and a board member and now pro bono legal counsel. I can certainly vouch for the opportunities for career advancement that participation in an international organization like this can bring. And I'll also say that in view of the fact that I myself made an international career move coming here to Washington from Canada in 1990, and having recently had the pleasure of participating with our guest speaker tonight, Stacie Berdan, on a panel at Wharton on globalization and how to get ahead, that this evening's performance, performance, it may be a performance, this evening's program will certainly provide a lot of valuable guidance on how to get ahead by going global. So with that, I turn it back over to Liesl, who I think is going to introduce the next speaker.
Thanks, Barbara. Tonight's event is very important and I think appropriate for George Washington University. The university has a long-standing tradition of supporting students interested in international careers and really training the international leaders of tomorrow. The International Business Department, I'm proud to say, here at George Washington University is ranked 5th in the world by the Financial Times. It is also the home of the new Global MBA, and I'd like to ask Associate Dean for Graduate Programming, Murat Turimçalar, to get up and talk a little bit to you about this exciting new program at GW.
Thank you, Liesl. Actually, I think Liesl did a good job about promoting my program, so maybe I should quit while I'm ahead. First of all, let me thank the panelists and CIBER and WIT for supporting this initiative. This is very important for us and very timely for us, because as the business school, particularly as the MBA program, we're going through a very radical curriculum upgrade right now. I'm calling this upgrade. Some people want to call it revision, but I think by making it more global, by committing ourselves to responsible leadership in the global environment, and by committing ourselves to experiential learning in the global environment, I think we're going to separate ourselves from other programs, and that's why this programs such as this are very important for us. There are quite many additions to our program for our curriculum right now, but one of the most important one and the more relevant one right now is we are going to require every single full-time MBA student, Masters of Business Administration student, to have an international residency in another country, in a foreign country, working on a specific project. We believe that the only way you can become global is by being in another country and working with a specific project. I lived this year by individual experience. I mean, obviously, I'm an international person. I was raised in Turkey. I lived in 4 different continents. And this year, trying to make some partners in India, I visited India for about 10 days or so. And before I went to that country, I read books, I saw movies, I became even knowledgeable about Bollywood, and I listened to BBC's India Rising program for hours, and I thought I was an expert on India. And I thought, coming from Turkey, country of contradictions, I thought I could be at home in India. And it wasn't until I sat down with people and tried to negotiate and tried to make some deals and partnerships, I realized that it's a very different experience to be there, to talk to other people from other cultures and try to understand them. There is no other experience that can prepare you for, if you want to be a global leader, other than being there and working on a specific project. And we're committed as GW Business School for that. And if you're interested in something like that, please come and visit us at the business school or check our website. All right, thank you very much.
Thanks, Murat. We begin first tonight. We have several parts to our program. We begin first with a keynote address. We will then follow with a panel discussion, and then we will take questions and answers from the audience. We have some wireless mics. I think that we're going to have some assistants go around to gather your questions. And then after the event, we're hoping you'll join us upstairs for a networking reception and book signing as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Stacie Berdan. Her impressive full bio is in your program. Stacie became vice president at the world's leading PR firm at the age of 27. She later jumped from vice president to global managing director after a 3-year stint in Asia. Her book, Get Ahead by Going Abroad, A Woman's Guide to Fast-Track Career Success, has taken the world by storm. She has been appearing all over the country talking to people about this very exciting book and inspiring all kinds of young people to think about what role going abroad will play in their career. We're very fortunate to have her here with us tonight, so please join me in welcoming Ms. Berdan.
Thank you, Liesl and Murat, and Barbara. It was a wonderful session that we had a couple of months ago. Very nice. You never know who you're going to meet where, so I always recommend that take those business cards and follow up. It's a pleasure to be here tonight to talk about this topic that I am passionate about. And so we'll go over a little bit about specifically the importance of going global and working internationally. First, though, I want to tell you a little bit about me. Liesl mentioned, and yes, my bio's in there, but specifically, when you look back, I was an executive for about 15 years in the corporate world. I worked in corporate communications for both Burson Marsteller and Unilever, a large multinational company. And when I look back and see the turning point in my career, it was when I was about 28 years old, and I took the opportunity to leave DC and go to Hong Kong and work for 3 years. Worked there for 3 years. I was a mid-manager here. When I went there, was a mid-manager, quickly rose to managing an office of more than 100 people, the P&L, expanding into China, and then eventually overseeing the region of some of our largest clients from Japan all the way down to Australia. And when I returned, I actually had made significant advancements, leapfrogged many of my peers. I tripled my salary, jumped a couple levels, and became a member, a WPP partner, top 1%, despite taking 6 months off to have my twin daughters a year after I had returned. So I looked at this success, thought maybe it was just a coincidence, the international time. But then I met and talked with a lot of other women, and it seemed we all seemed to have this coincidence in our lives. And at Unilever, I met my co-author, Perry Yateman, who also had it. We talked about, you know what, there's a book in here. We need to tell other people about this, because it seemed to be the best kept secret that a lot of people knew, but people really weren't talking about. So that's what led to the book, and it's great because I consider myself extremely lucky. Because of my international career, I was actually able to retire somewhat early and reinvent myself, and now I am able to actually talk about something that I care passionately about, spread the word, hopefully inspire a few of you tonight to give it a think and possibly do it as well. What's interesting, many times when I get up here and talk, I feel like one of those hosts on an infomercial. You know, I have this really simple solution that's going to totally change your life, but it's true. Some of those, I don't know if they're true or not, but this one is true. I do believe that pursuing an international assignment is something that absolutely everyone should do because it can fast-track your career beyond your wildest imagination. It happened to so many of us. Plus, you can have a really good time because it's a lot of fun to live in another country. The book specifically does focus on women. It is Get Ahead by Going Abroad, a woman's guide to fast-track career success. But I'd say 70 to 80% of it does apply to men. And although the lights are a little bright, I think I see a few men in the audience. Not sure whether you're here for the women or for the talk, but it does apply to you. And so for some of you, whether you're here thinking about your own career, if you have a friend, a colleague, a sister, a mother, a brother, anyone else in your life that you're thinking this might apply to, it really does apply to everyone. It has no bounds. The successes are for everyone. We're going to talk a little bit specifically about women. And it is very exciting to publish a book that is right now. The trend is here. Murat talked about the really exciting changes that are going on here, which is phenomenal because everything he said is absolutely true. Students today, I think an MBA is a wonderful thing to have, but I think the new thing that every single professional must have on their resume is international experience. And if you can get it at a university, a little bit of it at least, you're one step ahead of the next person, and that's what it's all about. When you go to get into the workforce, whether you work for a corporation, an organization, or a government, it's all about differentiation. What's so special about you? So that'll really help you. And the coverage we've got with the media, great too. The CNN, the NBC Weekend Today. I've been on Fox a couple of times. Everyone is really paying attention to it. We're on CNN again talking about the impact of this and the currency crisis. So people are really talking about this, which is great. Universities, companies, organizations, governments. Everyone is focusing on the importance. And it's not just the American angle. It's a global trend. The research we did for the book, in which we did an online survey anonymously of more than 200 women who had significant international experience, 35% of those were non-Americans, and they came from all over the world. And so it's not just for Americans going elsewhere. In the book, it was a Chinese woman who lived in New York, a Brit who lived in South Africa, a Brazilian who went to work in Russia. So it actually applies around the world for all nationalities as well. And they all said one thing, that going overseas can fast-track your career. It can increase your pay significantly. You can leapfrog peers, increase your responsibilities. Not to mention have a fabulous time living in some of the coolest places around the world. So there's a benefit there too. Now, why is this? Well, the global economy is here. I mean, we're no longer waiting for it to arrive. Competition's no longer in our backyard. All companies need to understand, operate in various markets around the world. If you just take a look at what's happening with the state of the US dollar and things that are happening economically, very quickly you realize that if you don't understand how this affects your business, you're going to lose out. In days, weeks, months, for you to take the time to get to understand exactly, how it applies to you, could mean millions and millions of dollars in business revenue. So it's very important to understand this. And American companies specifically are actually wise to this now, and they're sending more people overseas because there aren't enough people with international experience here. And so they have to send you there because, again, as Murat said, in order to work and succeed in the international business environment, you have to work in the international business environment, and the best way to do that is to live and work somewhere else because the pace is so much further, more accelerated. There's a whole lot more in the book and about the topic that I could talk about tonight, but there are 4 things that I want to leave you with. One, that going abroad is an excellent way to fast-track your career, and the time is now to do it. 2, there's no right time from a professional level or a personal stage. Some people think there is, there isn't. Based on the research, you can go anytime, and we'll talk about that. You can find and land an assignment. It'll be tough, but we'll talk about some tips. And that you can make the most of it personally and professionally, because it's not just about going over and doing it, it's about working it once you're there to maximize it for professional advantage. So we can talk about the first point, that going abroad actually can accelerate and fast-track your career. I mentioned that we did some research. The research that we did, 83% of the women in the book said that working overseas had a direct impact on compensation. 78%, 78% said that. 83%, it was key to their rapid advancement in the workplace. 71% agreed they were given greater responsibility earlier on in their careers because of it. And 53% agreed that it was one of the ways to break the glass ceiling. Many of you are so young, I hope you know what the glass ceiling is, but you know, women do hit certain barriers, and the women that have come before us and the generations that have worked have continued to break down the barriers, but they're still there, and it's hard. The beautiful thing about working overseas and being a woman, and again, it works for a man too, but the reason it's great for a woman is it actually helps you get around a lot of those barriers that you have, because people begin to treat you as an international business person, not a woman in finance or this, and you have skills that not many people have, so it's a real differentiator. So what is it about living and working overseas that actually does this? Well, there are a couple of things. 1, differentiation. 2, opportunities. And 3, the importance of cross-cultural workplace and diversity management. The business model and the business place of tomorrow does not look like what it looked like in the United States, for instance, 20 years ago. It's multicultural, cross-cultural. There are virtual teams where, such as I had when I worked for Unilever, people in 40 countries around the world. You never may meet them, but you still have to understand how to work with them, motivate them, and inspire them. So let's take kind of each one in turn. First, the differentiation. What that does is it kind of earns professionals a second look. You're doing something in a market that may not be as big or as hot, but you're doing some really neat, interesting things that you may not get to do if you stayed here. You might be a piece of a project as opposed to owning the entire project if you worked in a smaller market. 2, probably one of the most important things that we learned from our research was the general and line management experience you get when you work in a foreign market. If you're a mid-manager here, you'll probably never have P&L experience for a large company or manage a large team. But if you work, as I did, go into Hong Kong, very soon after, managing a team of 100 people, managing a P&L, overseeing how the bills are paid in a foreign currency, and then unfortunately having to lay off 30% of my staff, who all were Hong Kong Chinese, you learn an awful lot in that time, and that is directly translatable into the business environment back here or any large multinational, and leaders recognize that. And everyone says today, consultants, coaches, whoever you turn to, one of the most important ways, and you cannot get to the top, be it senior management or the C-suite, if you don't have line and management experience. Well, how do you get it? We say, go to another country and get it. Even if it is on a smaller scale, it still applies. And the other is high visibility. Many times people find it fascinating or curious that you want to work somewhere, such as my situation. My COO and COO, one being from Oklahoma, the other from Tennessee, could not understand why I really wanted to go to India, and they would not send a single woman to India. and then Hong Kong. And it just piqued their curiosity so much, they each took me under their wing. They'd come out and visit twice a year. And so I had these great contacts and connections with the leadership in our team simply because I wanted to go and live somewhere different and interesting. The third point as to why it really works is the interesting research that we did, or the results that came from the research. A lot of outside consultants and research firms talk about the skills of tomorrow's leaders. These are the skills that are actually, interestingly to us, the type that are needed in a cross-cultural situation. Because as I mentioned, the business model of tomorrow is cross-cultural management. And the skills a leader needs are those similar to the ones that we found are important to succeeding cross-culturally and working in another market. And then the big aha was these are the skills that actually women have. The innate feminine style, we like to call it, and a lot of the traits we've been dinged for having over the years. You know, you talk too much, you do this, you do that, you do consensus building. Well, in fact, these are the things that make you more successful overseas. And outside research that we've read as well, 18% more successful. Women are 18% more successful in cross-cultural situations than men. There are a lot of reasons for that. One is the skills and the traits, and that's what came out in ours as well, so we could talk about them. The first one is style flexing, or flexibility and adaptability. You must be able to turn on a dime and do all kinds of things in a strange situation that you cannot predict what might be happening. 2, communication skills. I mean, can you imagine where it would be more important to be able to communicate clearly, listen to not only what's being said, but to read between the lines in a place that is different. The social and cultural norms are different. The person you're dealing with may be speaking in their second language. You may be speaking through an interpreter, or it could be your second language. Communication skills are critical when you're living and working in a foreign market. And relationship building skills. Women have a great way of asking lots of questions and incorporating kind of an esprit de corps, we're all in this together, rah-rah team, when instead of many times people say, don't take hard decisions. But in fact, building the consensus, not necessarily a complete, equal situation in which everyone has a full say, but at least making everyone feel involved in part of the decision-making process. It's critical when you're working in a foreign market because the people there are going to have their own opinions, prejudices, stereotypes about who and what you are, and culturally speaking, may not raise them with you and you may never know. So you're going to need to learn to build the relationships. And the 4th, patience and persistence or grace under pressure. You need to know when to go and stop because you can't just run full steam ahead. The ones that I and many of my colleagues have seen, and the women in the book, crashed and burned when they did that. You really have to take it slow and keep your eyes and ears open at all times. So that's the reason why it actually works. There are these skills we have, the need, the global economy being here, and the conditions being right, and the companies needing it. So point number 2, what's the best time to go? Planning in life is great, but we all know life happens, and things don't always turn out the way we want them to. And so there are 2 truisms for international assignments. The first, it's never predictable. You may think you know what you're getting into. I guess the predictability is it's not going to be the way you think it's going to be, but you can't really determine what it's going to be like. The second, no 2 experiences are alike. You may go to the same place at the same age, the same level for the same company, and you can have a wildly different experience than the person before you. It's also different. But with that said, all that variety and difference, there are some kind of buckets that we can put them in so you can kind of decide what might be right for you. There are pros and cons to going at every level. Certainly as a young person, and I've heard it a lot, and I think it was in one of the sessions at Wharton that I was in with Barbara when someone stood up and said, we want them young and cheap right out of school. We want to hire and send people places. So actually going right out of school, good opportunity, because you cost less, you probably have less baggage, you probably don't have a whole bunch of kids in school yet, you may or may not be married, and so it's easier to go. However, you don't have a big toolbox, you haven't learned that much. Great education is great, but employers pay for experience. And so you need to consider that, and also make sure that you'd have a mentor back home, or maybe only spend 3 or 4 years, come back, and then go back out again. If you go as a junior executive, you have a few more skills under your belt and a little bit more knowledge, and probably you're beginning to build your network in your home office or organization. This will help you launch an international career and begin to accelerate faster. when you take the leap in middle management, that's where we saw the greatest gains. If you choose the right position or are allowed to take on the right position. That's what happened to me and so many of the people in the book is 7 to 10 years of experience, depending, under your belt, make the leap, and then you kind of skyrocket, such as Diane Guyas in the book. She worked for DuPont. She was 30 years old. They didn't want to send her to Europe. She got the assignment, and going from kind of like a mid-level manager with about 10 years of experience, she then was responsible for $250 million P&L across multiple markets. Did so well in that, they sent her to run an all-male 24/7 plant in Belgium, where they only spoke Flemish, I think, Belgium, Flemish and French. And then did so well there, again, being so young, coming back at 34, 35, was tapped by the CEO of DuPont to work directly for him, and is now groomed to the top, one of the top 10 people at DuPont. That was critical right when she went, and it happens to lots. Even senior executives, we interviewed some in the book. I did for senior people who said, I just can't get to that, that very, the next jump. I'm stagnant here. So they went to another region, became a regional president, had regional responsibilities, sat on the global boards and executive management teams, and then that took them to the very top. So it can work there as well. And there's no right family situation. Many people say, oh, I'm married, I can't go. I have kids, I can't go. It's not the same anymore. The dynamic one of double income families and women and men exchanging roles and role reversal going on all over the place leads a world of opportunities for both men and women. If you're married, I went married. My husband left World Resource Institute, where he worked here, followed me, had a great time, thought he was going to get in on the ground movement for the environmental movement in China, which still has not happened. So he was wrong there. He was pushing the, didn't even understand why people didn't recycle. I don't think they still don't recycle. But that kind of careened off, and so he was like, oh no, now what am I going to do? But one of the things that I had promised when I went was to, I promised him, as we agreed to go together, was that we would travel. I wouldn't just work all the time, because I had a tendency to work all the time. And so I agreed. And so every weekend, we saw all of Asia. I mean, the only place I didn't see is Papua New Guinea. I've been all over the place, every major city, multiple times for business. If I went, he'd come along, we'd extend the weekend. And he then reinvented himself as a photojournalist, which he still does today, which is really cool job. So as a travel writer. So that can happen as well, but you have to have a strong marriage. Everybody who is married says, everyone knows that it's tough to live in a foreign market because you're challenged all the time with the difference and the variety, and it gets very tiring and it can be very stressful. And so you have to have a really strong partnership, otherwise it can fall apart. So yeah, I do have to take some caution there. And I'm finding that a lot more people now are just living apart for a couple years or doing assignments in different countries. All kinds of interesting models are now available. So as you begin to graduate and think about whether you're getting married or not, don't ever let certain situations like that stop you unless you want them to stop you. If there's a reason that you believe is truly would inhibit your success. And I think also going as a single person, great to go. You integrate faster because you have to. You need a network. We're social creatures. We need people around us. We need a support structure. And so people will integrate faster that way, but there's a tendency to overwork. That's the one danger. So you got to keep an eye or have a safety check with a friend, a system set in place. And then, of course, going with kids, what better way to bring up global citizens, especially those of tomorrow, than to have them exposed to such diversity and interesting situations around the world. So everyone's done it. 25% of the women had children, 45% were married. So, and these are taken from people who have worked all the way far back as 80, 82. So it was happening then, it's definitely happening even more so now. So you can go anytime, any level, don't ever let that inhibit you. And don't have it let your HR or the people that are sending you have it inhibit them as well. I just spoke to someone the other day who said, a headhunter told me not to do this. I'm like, well, did they give you reasons? No, it wouldn't be good for your career not to go to Singapore without a job, essentially. And you're too young in your career to do that. I said, well, had they been overseas? Well, no. Well, did they speak from any experience? No. I'm like, well you know, why would you listen to them? And that's what we're finding, actually, and that's why it's so important to me to talk to all kinds of people, because there's so much misinformation out there, specifically about women working in these foreign environments as well. So important point number 3 is, how can you do it? How can you land it? Well, the first important question is to ask yourself if it's right for you. Because in our research, 95% of the respondents said it is not for everybody. So it isn't right for everybody, and only you can determine that. But we do, in Chapter 2, give you a list of questions to ask yourself to kind of get a feel for whether it's right for you. Things like, do you have a sense of adventure? Do you thrive on diversity? Do you work well outside your comfort zone? Do you like to work well, and do you thrive and really succeed in a free fall situation? Kind of delivering and learning new things while you have no grounding, because that's many times I felt like I was falling off a building, actually, and you have to actually continue to move on. Can you go the extra mile all the time? Because it is hard work. It's not a piece of cake. And I think most importantly, everyone said, do you have a sense of how you do with failure? Can you fail, pick yourself up, and move on? Because we all failed, made lots of mistakes, some little ones and some big ones, and you have to be able to learn from them to move on and not have it crush you or beat yourself up about it, because that's an important point. So if you've decided that you've got that sense of adventure, you're ready to do it, landing the job is the most difficult part. As I said, companies are wise to it, people want to do it, everyone knows you have to do it, so it's really tough and competitive to get the jobs. It's also expensive for companies and organizations to send people. So how can you do it? 1, because it is expensive and companies are very selective, you must be at the top of your game. Be it as you're graduating from school, what is it that's different about you? Do you have some international experience? Do you have an international internship, perhaps? Do you speak another language? You need to figure out a way, if you don't have much work experience, what differentiates you. And if you do have experience, flawless performance at all times. You must be considered a superstar to be relied on, because if they're sending you somewhere else, know that they're going to send you with a nice little kind of ticket and a couple of tips, and you're on your own, because that's essentially what happens. So you've got to be able to perform. 2, do your research. What is it about you? What skills do you have? What countries are needed? Where are the growth opportunities? Maybe not necessarily today. Everyone knows that China is growing. That's why everybody's going there. What's the next country 2, 3, 4 years from now? Where are the other markets that people aren't paying attention to? What can you do to help your company, your business, your organization grow? Where's your industry growing? What resources matter to it? Think about it really smartly and strategically position yourself for that move. 3, you have to tell as many people as possible about your desire to go overseas for these assignments. If you just put it in the, check the box in an annual review, that's great. Tell your supervisor, that's great, but odds are they're not going to come looking for you, willing to send you to Rome or Paris or Beijing. It doesn't happen. You have to tell as many people as possible, network internally, externally, make your connections, talk with people so that everyone knows and can help you. One of the things I did that actually was not my brilliant idea, but a senior mentor that I had told me, since I like to travel so much, when I was junior and just starting at Burson, every time I went on a vacation, international one, it was usually with a friend or with my parents or tagging on somewhere here or there, I would actually tell my supervisor if there was an office there. I did it with Paris, London, Rome, Milan, Seoul, and Tokyo, that I wanted to meet the people in the office. So they're like, oh, wow, you want to spend a day of your vacation? So I would spend a day of my vacation networking, talking with people in these offices about what was going on there. And I built myself a reputation as someone who really was serious about it because I spent some time there. You have to think about things like that that'll help you. And I think the last important point really is go where they want to send you. If you think you want to have that nice apartment in Paris and living in France, or Beijing is where you want to go, and they say, sorry, you're going to Sao Paulo, Brazil, don't say no. Take it. And the odds are, the second move, you'll probably get the assignment of your choice if there's a need again. But don't decline it if it's not where you want to go. The fourth point in how to make the most of it, that's what half of the book is about. What is it about the time there? And so I'm going to give you just 5 tips to keep in mind. The first thing, to make the most of it, both professionally and personally. First, you have to figure out the cultural and social norms once you get there, so you can begin integrating and working as quickly as possible. But you can't rush it because it takes time. 2, you have to challenge yourself, and don't be afraid to fail. Keep pushing yourself so that you continue to do more. 3, you got to network like crazy. There, joining professional organizations, business associations, making sure at the same time that you build a network, not only in that market, but either back in your headquarters if you were transferred, or with building slowly an international network as well. It's a really small group of people that used to be called expats are now called global workers, because expat is a negative term in many places in the world. And they're growing, and it's a growing number, but it's a small network that you can easily tap into once you're one of the club. 4, if you're a woman, and even if you're not, men, if you want to get in touch with your feminine side, tap into those skills because they really help. Remember them when you're going somewhere else, because you're going to face culture shock, and you're going to panic, and you're going to, react in a way. Just take a step back, keep it cool, and kind of remember that listening is good. The way you communicate is important. The style flexing, and that will really help. And 5, of course, is to have fun. It's not only about work. Although most of us went because we thought it would be fun, now in looking back, we're like, wow, did it really help us? And that's why I'm here, is to tell you that actually it really does help. But you can also have a lot of fun too, and you shouldn't give up the opportunity to see the world while you're actually working around the world as well, because that too helps you in your personal and your professional growth. So before you pack your bags, there's one more point that I have to say, which is it's not always a bed of roses. It's not always fun. It's not always easy. Sometimes you're way up here, a great, great high, and then the next day you could be really low. I felt I was like on this wild roller coaster for the first year, which I found out later was very common, but no one told me was the case. And then eventually it starts to peter off, and you're in somewhat of a normal thing, but it's not always so great. And the reason is, it's hard, and great rewards and payoffs actually come with really hard work and sometimes some tough conditions. So some of the things that you might run into are role reversals if you're married. I can't tell you how many times my husband was asked, who do you work for? Or I was asked, what does your husband do and why was he sent here? It becomes very uncomfortable after a while, and it strains. It feels very strained. Embarrassment with language. One of my favorite stories in the book is my co-author, who's a 5'10" redhead in Singapore, so she's already standing out. She's sitting in a bar after a client meeting with some British colleagues, and a song comes on the radio or the jukebox or whatever it was that was playing, and it's a shag song. She jumps up and says, I love to shag, a shag here, shag there, shag throughout college. Do you want to shag with me? Well, if you know what shag means, in the British term, it does not mean dance. It means something much more intimate. And she was mortified, right? So there are these moments that you just want to crawl away. You can't believe some of the things that you do, and almost every single one of us has about 10 stories like that. And sometimes it's just language and just cultural differences. Financial confusion, paperwork, taxes, where are you getting paid, who's paying you, how's it, I can't tell you how many times my funds weren't transferred and I bounced checks all over the place because of it. So all those kinds of things happen as well. But at the end of every interview, I asked every single person, would you do it all over again, despite some of these things? And every single one said, absolutely, yes, I had the time of my life. So I had the time of my life, and I'm really happy to be here tonight, and I look forward to kind of broadening out this and hearing what some of the questions you have as we move into our panel. But that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stacie. We now move actually into the panel part of our program. So I would like to ask Stacie and our panelists to join us here up on stage. We'll have seated to, looking at from the audience's left, we'll have Betsy Tyson, who's the Vice President of Government Affairs International at GlaxoSmithKline. Seated next to her will be Susan Cronin, Senior Manager, Latin America Government Relations at Apple. And then Karen Kirchneck, Senior Advisor, International Water Policy at the Nature Conservancy. And then lastly, of course, we'll have Stacie. What we'll do here is I have a couple of questions for the panelists. I'll ask a question, and then we'll begin with Betsy, if that's okay, and then we'll kind of go around the circle with each panelist sort of sharing their own perspectives and input. And then we'll end with Stacie, who will share some of her own experiences as well and maybe make some tiebacks to the book. So we'll do a couple of questions, but I hope those of you out there in the audience will start to think of questions on your own. After we do a couple of rounds up here, we'll turn it over to you out there in the audience, okay? So our first question, let's just start with, how did you learn about and land that first international job?
Yeah.
Betsy?
I actually had two international experiences, so I'll just quickly mention both. The first time I was in the first Bush administration at an organization called the United States Information Agency, and they needed someone to raise $13 million in private sector funding for the U.S. presence at the 1992 exposition in Seville, Spain. And I was the only person at the agency with any fundraising experience, and they said, "Do you want to do it?" And I thought to myself, how could I not? So I wasn't, unlike Stacie's comment, I wasn't looking for that overseas assignment, but it was just too good of an offer to pass up. Then the second time, I was approached by the head of corporate affairs for a major British-based pharmaceutical company who was looking for someone to run their worldwide global charitable program. So I moved directly from Seville, Spain to London, England.
That's great.
Well, my first international experience is going to seem very tame compared to that. I sort of fell into the whole international thing because of my husband. My husband was in the U.S. Army, and after several years, we finally had to go overseas, and our first overseas tour was Korea. And so I started looking around to see what I could do while we were there, and I wound up as a reading specialist working on teaching at the international school there, and also teaching at Dankook University at night, Korean engineering students. And that was probably the most interesting experience, I guess, in terms of my first dip into international waters, in that what I learned about Korean culture, about just about everything about the place, from teaching 70 male engineering students at night how to speak English, was quite amazing. So that's my story, at least the beginning of it.
Okay, for me, well, I had graduated law school, and I was working at a law firm, and I actually went to a talk, kind of like you here tonight, but it was at the National Zoo. And it was a number of speakers there who were talking about environmental management, environmental protection problems in Eastern Europe. And I listened to the presentations. I thought, this is really interesting. And afterwards, I went up to one of the presenters and said, you know, would you be interested? Would you have time to talk with me? I'd love to talk more with you about it. And so I ended up going to her office, and then over a matter of weeks, basically maneuvered my way to create a project working in what was Czechoslovakia. And I should give a little bit away. I'm originally from what was Czechoslovakia. I was born there, and we escaped and came to the United States in over 35 years ago. So I've grown up in the United States, really. But you know, in essence, it was just going up to a presenter saying, I'm very interested in what you're doing. Is there some way I could work with you? And actually, they did have, it's not like we completely created a project. They were trying to look at how environmental protection was developing in Central and Eastern Europe at that time. And so I basically said, look, you don't even have to hire me as a staff person, because you know, there were issues in terms of working, as you said, working abroad and so forth. I'll be as a consultant at first. You know, I'll do this project for you, and I'll be based in what was Slovakia at the time. And so really, I mean, for me, it was just going up to a presenter after a presentation at the National Zoo.
What's interesting, actually, Karen is actually one of the women in the book, we should say, so you can read a little bit more about her interesting background there, too. But I think every single one of these stories, actually, we found in the book with research, and what's interesting about them is it shows the diversity, I think, in the way you can actually get a job. Sometimes it's chance, and you're offered it, which is an amazing opportunity that you shouldn't turn down if you're interested. Or I love the fact that you went with your husband and actually made the most of it, which shows you that if you do go with your partner, you actually can begin an international career that way, which is very promising. And I think one of the things that's quite interesting about today's times with many Chinese nationals, Indians coming and living here is similar to Karen's story. There are now companies, Brazilians too, and Russians. Companies are looking for foreign nationals who have kind of grown up here, or the escaped move, whatever it is, come here, grown up here, know the language, know the culture, and then can integrate a whole lot faster. The really interesting part about that, though, I'm finding is that they don't want to treat you like the global worker or the expat. They want to treat you like local. So just if you're in that situation, make sure you're careful and you really fight for your rights, because there's no reason that you shouldn't be treated like an international worker, I think, as well. My personal experience is I wanted to go to India, as I said, which got the ball rolling for me. And about 9 months later, I was in Hong Kong after lobbying hard to go and having a few friends and mentors actually say she really could do it and she is interested. So great ways to do it.
Well, many people, when they go abroad for the first time, say that they found something or experienced something that they hadn't really expected that surprised them. What was the greatest surprise that you encountered when you went abroad, and what did you learn from that?
Well, I think after spending 10 months in the frying pan of Spain, Seville, Spain, and moving to England, I really expected England to be a piece of cake, jolly old England, similar language, etc. And I think the biggest surprise for me was really how deep the cultural differences are. Yes, we have a common language, but the divisions were much more pronounced. And I think that caught me off guard. I think it was much more subtle, and I also found, frankly, some kind of deep-seated and fairly intense anti-Americanism that was tough to have to deal with. So I think that was the biggest surprise to me, that expecting things to just be so easy in London, fabulous city, and actually finding it quite a challenge.
Well, I think what my biggest surprise was how much I liked it, because I certainly had never planned on having an international career at all. I had planned on living in the United States forever and having a horse. One of the big tragedies of my life was going to Korea meant I had to sell my horse and stop my trajectory towards the 3-day eventing in the Olympics. So the United States Olympic team's loss, so I guess was Korea's gain. But I really found that Korea, as someone from my background, I come from Hicksville, for heaven's sake, being dropped into a culture so tremendously different, because it is, with the time zone, with everything, and this was quite a few years ago, before the internet, before cheap international telephone calls, there was no going home. And I found that I adjusted very quickly, that I even without much language, I had a few words I could mangle. I got across town. I even found, amazingly enough, through networking, a riding stable in Seoul, Korea, where I found a horse. And I could go on weekends in my riding breeches, and for the mere promise of getting a genuine American absorbing liniment for everybody's horse, I rode. So there was a big surprise.
I guess for me, my family, we had escaped Czechoslovakia. I mean, we've lived in, not harsh conditions, but different conditions. But then, growing up in the U.S., I have to say we were very fortunate. We came to Washington, D.C., and, we learned English and kind of, had fairly comfortable lives. And so I would say, working internationally for me, one of the things that first struck me as with surprises is just really being upfront and close with different people's living conditions. And this varies. I mean, for example, I was working in Armenia, and we were working with the Ministry of Environment there. And ministries of environment, ministries of water, ministries of natural resources throughout the world are obviously the ugly stepchilds who get the less of resources, financial resources, to do what needs to be done. And we were working with this ministry and their department of enforcement, and they basically asked me, they said, is there anywhere in your budget we could just get a computer? Because we just don't have a computer in this department. And they're still going out and doing enforcement actions. I mean, and other countries where I've worked in as well, a lot of it just still papers. I mean, and that's rapidly changing, but it's still, you know, it's not like everybody, you know, I was teaching as an adjunct at my law school, and it's like every student has a computer. And, you know, I work with ministries of environment and others where they don't have that many computers. Or even like working in Africa, we're working on some of the projects, you know, where you go visit, you know, a shanty town today. You know, it's not, you know, I've been working in this field for 15 years, so it has been, you know, 15 years ago, but even in the last year, 2 years, you know, you visit a place where there are 90,000 people and they're living with 9,000 porta-johns, and that's their bathroom facilities. Or even, you know, even closer to home, I've worked on projects in the colonias on the Mexican-U.S. border where we're trying to develop sanitation programs because they just don't have sanitation facilities. So for me, I think, you know, that's been really the biggest surprise, is just on a daily basis being up front and close with people who just have really not much. And amazing to see how they invite you into their home and are willing to share with you their experiences when they just really have nothing. And I have to say, one of the things that for me, I remember when one of the assignments, because I've been working, since I took that first job that I described, I've been basically working internationally since then. But one of the times I came back from working internationally, I have to say I was at a mall, a shopping mall at Tyson's actually, and I was going on the escalator and I just basically just couldn't handle it. I just had to leave the mall because for me it was just such a shock to have all of this there, and having been living in conditions, I was living in Siberia at that time, came back to the U.S., I just really couldn't even handle it. And so that's something too to bear in mind, is that, you know, if you go abroad, depending on the kind of conditions you're working in, I mean, if you're not like, you know, some senior vice president who has, you know, luxury apartments or anything, if you're living in conditions that are not necessarily the ones you would have here, coming back can also be a serious adjustment, and that's something to keep in mind.
That's a great point, actually, because most people think that's the easy part, and you think you've done all these wonderful things. And in fact, many companies are not prepared to deal with you when you return. So you really have to look at it as, and it is the second hardest part of the assignment, which is readjusting, making your expertise, your skills known, because most people don't know and they don't care. I came back from Hong Kong to DC, and a lot of my colleagues thought Hong Kong was part of Japan. And that was really embarrassing, you know, because you're like, Hong Kong Chinese or everyone throughout knows so much about America. They would talk about, you know, Puritan history and religion, and they were fascinated with all these things, and yet we don't even know where it is. And so it's a bit embarrassing like that, but it's more than that. It's reverse culture shock. You come back in, your head, what we like to say, I think, is your head screwed on differently forever. You can't get it back to the way it was before, yet you have to learn to live with your neighbors, your friends, your brothers, your sisters again here, and it is quite difficult.
I just can't resist adding something to that, because I've lived in many third world countries, and when you come back and you finally realize that you really do not have to carry toilet paper with you everywhere you go.
Yes, absolutely.
Everyone who's lived there knows what I mean.
Can I just quickly add to that too, because it's I think one of the biggest learnings I had. I went to London thinking I'd be there for 2 years and stayed for 10. Coming back to Washington was extremely difficult, because you come back and for the first 6 months you're at cocktail parties and your friends say, oh, it's our friend Betsy, she lived in London for 10 years. And that gets you by at a cocktail party for about a month or two, and then pretty soon that wears off and you're just good old Betsy from Grand Rapids, Michigan again. And I found the reentry quite difficult. I had changed profoundly. My friends had changed, my approach to life, my global view, my cultural mores. You know, I had just really changed. And I think don't underestimate, you think about all these, how to go abroad, but it's very important to also plan how you come back.
And I'll just quick to add to that too. And also, I mean, one of the things, you know, we've talked about children and marriages and so forth, but something to also consider is your friendships. I mean, I know when I was living that time, it was in Russia, and there was a period when I had 5 weeks, I had no water in my apartment, no hot water, no cold water. So I was carrying water from my office where the elevator didn't work, so I was walking up 10 flights of stairs every day. So I'd get water from there in these big water jugs and carry it to my apartment so that I could use that for everything that you need, like bathing, showering, cleaning dishes, everything. And I was talking to some friend of mine who had called me, and she was crying because her Mercedes had broken down here. And I just was like, I have to say, I mean, I really almost lost it. I just couldn't believe, you know, and our friendship definitely over a period of time has kind of lulled off because we kind of have different values, I realized, and she didn't really seem to care to understand what I was going through. And so I was like, well, okay, that's just how it is.
Well, we've talked a lot about sort of the challenges of re-entry. What about the challenges that you actually experienced when you were abroad? What was sort of one of the major challenges that you faced, and how did you deal with it? And again, what did you learn from it?
I think for me, as a woman joining a fairly male-dominated, British-based global company, it was developing credibility within the business. And Stacie said this during her remarks, I think it was absolutely critical for me to build very, very quickly my own internal credibility by building good networks and using my people skills and my collaborative sort of nature, and to build those links. Also, I was in an area called charitable giving, and that really wasn't, at that time, very integrated with the commercial side of the business. So I had to build a rationale for why I was there, what I was trying to do, how would it help the business, and to really work on that internal networking. One of probably the best things I did was to go directly to the CEO about 6 months after taking the job and to say to him, I really am not feeling comfortable about how we are promoting ourselves and connecting with communities around the world, and I think we should take a blank sheet of paper and start over. And he was shocked by that. But my suggestion was that I would get his help in identifying 10 of the top up-and-coming executives from across the business to help me with this thinking, rather than me just doing it on my own. And that was a huge breakthrough for me, not only professionally but personally, but it helped put the program on the map within the company. It helped put me on the map within the company, and I think helped me move from the charitable giving side of our company into a government affairs role a few years later. So that internal network and working that network was critical.
Thank you.
Well, my first experience, independent of my family and my own real career, began when I joined the Foreign Service and went to Mexico, to the border to Juarez. And I think the challenge there, I guess, was trying to affect any kind of change that would mean anything in an institution like the State Department, particularly starting out as a junior officer with probably certainly more years and more experience than my fellow junior officers. And one of the things that I did to make the job, if any of you do contemplate an international career, I have to say that starting in the Foreign Service is a wonderful way to figure out whether or not this is for you, and to get the kind of skills that will stand you in good stead if you do move to the private sector. But for me, it was trying to make something out of the rather tedious first tour jobs that everyone in the Foreign Service has, which means handing out visas. So I was lucky that I had a boss, the guy who was the Consul General, who gave new officers an awful lot of latitude about doing things that might be useful and maybe a little different. So what I did was I decided to figure out who was coming to the United States from Mexico permanently. And I was able to organize the visa examiners and have them keep track of the human capital that these people brought with them. And I devised a plan to look at, actually it wound up being 2,500 immigrant visas, and do an analysis of what it was that they brought with them, what level of education and so on. And it was interesting for me. It's particularly interesting as I reflect on it in the current illegal immigration debate. But I think the challenging part, and the thing that was good for me to learn, was that if you network, if you get people to take some ownership of an idea that you have and feel some satisfaction from the success of that idea, you can really do an awful lot with a very diverse group of people. And as you move through, particularly in the international scene, trying to accomplish things, that stood me in good stead. So it was a challenge, and it wound up being kind of fun.
For me, I guess one of the challenges was, again, similar kind of, I think, to Betsy, of moving into a kind of a male-dominated area. It was this project when I was living in Siberia in Russia, and I was managing actually a World Bank project. So I was the project manager, on-ground project manager there, based and living in Western Siberia. And we had there was a welcome dinner, soon after I arrived to live there, and I think this is actually in the book. It was in this town, it was basically a very industrial town. It's where Peter the Great moved all of the major industries. So you had the aluminum, the steel, all of the major industries were there. And it was 25 heads of these industrial enterprises, all men, obviously, very senior men, far senior than me. And I guess they somehow chose this one guy to be their representative, and he stood up at the table. It was a very long table, we had the dinner and everything. And he basically said to me, and my colleagues, why don't you just give us your World Bank money and go home? So then I stand up and I said, well, thank you for your comment. That's not going to happen. We're going to have to learn how to work together here. We're here to look to see how we can improve environmental management here in Russia, and let's toast to that. And then I just did a shot of vodka. And there were many more shots of vodka over that period of time, but it was one of those things where, I don't know how I actually somehow got up and did that, but it was one of those things where you've just got to stand your ground. I mean, right from the get-go, if they had sensed any weakness right there, I would have been a goner, and my whole team would have been a goner, and our whole project probably would have been a goner. But you just got to, I can't even remember how young. I was still fairly young, and a woman, all men, just stand up and just feel confident, and it'll all work itself out somehow. I mean, it was a very bumpy ride. I have to say that whole project was a really bumpy ride, but they did end up working with us, and I think it's that having that being assertive without being arrogant. That's, I would say, is very key. Being assertive without being arrogant and standing your ground is very important, especially as a woman.
I have a couple of comments on that. One is, in addition, I think, to the Foreign Service, and I'm going to talk about Karen's comments in a second. The Peace Corps is another thing, I think, too, a great opportunity. And many times people say, oh, yeah, but I go to Africa or Central America. What'll that do for me if I want to go be in on the action in China? But actually, there are great problem-solving skills. You learn so much in such a short period of time. Many of the people who came back and actually had to then convince people that actually, even though they were 25 years old, they really did have all this experience listed on their resume. That then becomes the challenge there. But both Foreign Service and Peace Corps are great ways to start it. I think to Karen's point about being a woman and being, assume that you can be pushed over and you're not going to stand your ground. The vast majority of the women we interviewed for the book, actually, the two greatest challenges were one that was that, either being assumed that because you're a woman in certain cultures that you didn't matter, and so they could just kind of push you around. And so the firm, assertive, confident stance approach works. That, as well as, I think, being an American in other cultures, especially now. I'm very sorry to say it's even more difficult, of course, for the obvious reasons. But that's the other thing, is we go into places many times, actually, and this was my greatest surprise, is actually I was kind of a bit fearful as to how my team would think of me. And in fact, they gave me the benefit of the doubt. They're like, and this is one of those paradoxes that occurs that's kind of fascinating, which is, oh, well, we know what Americans are like because we watch TV, right? And that's where they get most of their ideas from, most people around the world. And America does not really reflect. We're much more conservative, I think, than what people see on TV. And they, but we're, you're not like that. We like you. We don't really like most Americans, but we like you. And that happens almost everywhere. So it's a really interesting thing, and it happens in reverse too. You're like, oh, well, I really don't like this culture, but I like you. And so that happens. And to make the most of that, that was what was so surprising to me. And one of the challenges of actually first getting through some of that, you're American, we're just supposed to listen to what you said. There have been a bunch of you before. So we'll just do it. And then my being surprised at how hard I had to actually work to convince them that truly I was different and I really did want their opinion. And that was across the board in a lot of the women we talked to. said the same thing. And I think the other is that being many of the women were the firsts in their situation, so there was no precedent, and we didn't know how to act or necessarily what to do as a woman. And so I think all of the examples you've heard are similar to that, and so you'll still be the first and precedent setting. And the challenges can be daunting when you have nowhere to turn for maybe a little bit of case study or history as to how it might have worked. But usually if you go on your gut and you're just kind of smart and you think and you focus on some of the things that we've talked about already tonight, it usually does work out well.
Well, we've got an awful lot of people in the audience, I think, whose interest has been piqued about how to go abroad to get ahead. My last question for the panel before we turn it over to the Q&A is, do you have, if you had to pick one or two pieces of specific advice you might want to give them, what would it be?
First of all, 3 quick pieces, I think. Going abroad, I think, read Stacie's book. I didn't have the luxury of having it before I made the decision, and I went in quite a naive way. But luckily, I had a company that was moving me to London, and I had a lot of support. But things like what neighborhood to live in, how to pay your taxes, and as Stacie said, you really have to do your homework and make sure you're going abroad with your eyes wide open. Secondly, while you're there, I'm a firm believer in not just getting sucked into what we used to call the expat group. There are hundreds of, there are thousands of Americans living in London, for example, and there were lots of Americans in Seville the year I was there. But I made a conscious effort not to just get grouped with the other Americans. I think I would have been selling myself and my experience short. So I did all I could to have an American-style barbecue and invite people from all over the world to my house for a hamburger, which is about all I can cook. But really try to blend in and not just, it's very easy to get caught into that expat global worker group. And I really don't think that's the way to go. And then, as I mentioned before, think a lot about your reentry coming back and be emotionally, financially, et cetera, prepared. It's very, very difficult. The taxes coming back were a nightmare. Figuring out how you pay taxes after living 10 years abroad was really challenging. So little pieces of advice for each step of the journey, but it's still worth doing.
Well, my advice would be a little bit different, or my experience anyway. I would say whatever you do, everything leads to something else if you think about it that way. I certainly didn't have a career across the board in international corporations. I was in the Foreign Service and then at the U.S. Trade Representative. Now I'm with a company and I represent them internationally. But every single thing, being the appointments clerk at the military clinic in Ankara, Turkey, gave me a tremendous experience that I got to know people. I was the gatekeeper for the American doctor. Boy, that was probably the most powerful position I've ever had in my life. and I got to know people through that and about their culture and about their worries and about what they wanted to do. And the other thing I would say is sweep the floor. Because whatever you do, I mean, make yourself available for the things that maybe you might not think your status would make it appropriate for you to do, but that's where you really find out what's going on. When I first joined the Foreign Service, for instance, just a little sweeping the floor story, I discovered that the secretary was the one who was responsible for sorting all the cables every morning. This was before things were electronic. And I thought, well, that's silly. She knows everything that's going on. So I said, well, I'll do that. I'll be happy. I come in early. And I read the summary of every cable that everybody in the office was looking at. Sweeping the floor, making it neat for everybody, learned an awful lot, helped me out an awful lot. So everything you do will lead to something more interesting and better, I think. And everything that you do that you might not think is the most important thing at the time will also help out.
A few things what I would say. One is, I think Stacie mentioned this in her presentation about kind of your relationships if you're married or single or something like, my first experience I went, my husband was my fiance then, and he quit his job here and moved over with me. Since that time, there have been years when I lived overseas and he stayed in the United States, and I would just come back every 4 months, or sometimes I'd come back every 3 weeks for a week and then go back over. So one of those things I would just say is, depending on where you are in your familial status, you know, if it's something you really want to do, it'll work itself out. I mean, if your relationship is strong enough, you know, I feel like I'm with the right person because we respect each other and what we want to do with our careers. If we didn't, we really shouldn't be together. So I just don't worry too much about that, I think. If it's right for you and you feel like it's right for you to go abroad, then make it happen. The second thing I would say is, when I mentioned earlier about being assertive and not arrogant, is leave your judgments behind. You know, especially if you're living in situations in countries where people have conditions that are just, you know, not, you know, Potomac, Maryland, or Fairfax, Virginia. Don't come with judgments, predetermined judgments, and certainly don't make your judgments there known. It's, you know, people are, you know, live in different conditions, and we just have to respect that. If we can help to improve those conditions, we should certainly try and help them. But don't carry with you a level of arrogance that we all know how to do everything in the United States, and no one else seems to know how to do it. I know, even with some of the environmental management work that I've done, I've learned so much from others in other countries. And it may not be, you know, they didn't have all the monitoring equipment, they didn't have all of the computers, they didn't have everything, but they were still working their butts off to actually improve environmental conditions in their countries, and I have to respect that. And then the third thing was kind of like what Betsy said with the expat community. Don't get stuck in the expat community. You know, there are some people I've known who were in that expat community, and I feel like they should have almost stayed in the United States. Because they really, I mean, I have such great memories, I mean, especially like the time when I bring back again this experience in Russia. People think I'm crazy, but I look back at that as one of the most wonderful periods of my life, because every weekend I went either canoeing or cross-country skiing or caving with Russians. And there would be Russians who were teaching English to their students, and I'd go help, you know, speak English so they could get their language conversation going and so forth. And so actually in the city I was living in, I really have no idea who the Americans who were living in that city, because I really didn't interact with them the whole time. And I still have such a beautiful experience from that period of my life that I'll never forget it.
There's a lot of tips, and that's why I wrote a book, so you can actually read all of those. But the two actually that stand out for me are related to all three of our panelists' comments, and that would be one, to make local friends. Similar to the kind of get out of the expat community, some of my best friends are Hong Kong Chinese still. Some came actually to be, which is a little tough at the time when you're having twins, there for the birth of my child, so they kind of hung around Washington for a while. That's how special they thought that was for me and to them. So I think making friends locally, yes, within the broader community, because once you do go and you are forever changed, there's a very small segment of the world that really thinks like you. And so it's very important to have people who actually do think like you in your personal life, not just because professionally it helps, but personally, so actually you can kind of function and move on and have people to turn to talk about the interesting things and the experiences that you've had that not that many people have.
Great. Well, thank you to our panelists. I'd like to turn the discussion also over to our audience. I think we have some mics. We have assistants. If you have a question for the panel, if you could just raise your hand, and one of our assistants will come to you with the microphone.
What were your prospective majors, and what bearing do you think that had on the first careers that you had when you got out of college?
I was a Russian politics and literature major at the University of Michigan, and it had absolutely no bearing whatsoever on the balance of my career. My first job in Washington was with a major political fundraising and communications company, and I just happened to land a job with a phenomenal human being who pushed me and kept encouraging me, and that's why I had the guts to take these risks and go abroad and really try things that I never thought I could achieve. But my background had nothing to do with it. I would never have the role I have now if I were applying now. I would have to have a legal or a management or a business degree, trade background, etc. So don't follow my path necessarily.
Well, mine's even worse. Lady Clip Catholic College for Women and Columbus College University in Georgia, a degree in history and art and a master's degree in reading. Yeah, well, reading's always good. But I would say that in the United States, it really is quite phenomenal that the United States government, the Foreign Service Officers Test is sort of the great equalizer. If you pass the Foreign Service Officers Test, I was very daunted when I joined the Foreign Service to find myself in the company of people who had exactly the kind of Ivy League education that you would expect. And yet, I did just fine. And so I think that it's interesting, your background. I think that the thing is, life is so amazing. What you do with what you have is where you get. And I would never let anybody tell me that where I started would limit me in any way.
For me, well, my undergrad was political science from Duke University, which I find just so general. I still don't even remember what I studied, to be honest, as under political science. But I then got a law degree from University of Maryland. And I will say something about the law degree. For me, it helped immensely, especially in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, because lawyers, even my family, we have little arguments over this, but lawyers and doctors are still at a very different status. And the fact that I could put the equivalent of Esquire on my business card when I went over kind of shot me up and got me in the door when it probably shouldn't have. I mean, just based on the experience I had then, probably I had not much. But having the law degree really certainly helped me. And I have to say, for me, I actually started out at University of Miami Law School, and I decided I wanted to focus on international environmental policy, which at that point was still really a developing, emerging field. It still is, but even back then. And I actually transferred law schools because I decided, the international law department was not strong enough and the environmental law department was not strong enough. And Maryland's environmental law department, I think, is like 5th or 6th in the nation. And the classes I took there and the experiences I had there, I worked at EPA, I worked for an environmental group, definitely helped me because even when I worked at a major consulting firm years later, they calculated the years that I worked during law school in calculating my salary. So for me, the law degree and particularly the emphasis on international environmental law helped me, particularly in my career.
For mine, undergraduate in communication theory and art history and English lit as a master's. So mine didn't directly apply either. But interestingly, in doing the research, not to date any of us up here, if I do, I apologize, but it seems as though those who went 80s, 90s, it almost had nothing to do. It was the fact that you had great skills and you wanted to do it and you went. And you could succeed, and then it just kept moving you forward. But now we're finding that for companies, and these are many of the people in the book who advise and mentor young people in their companies and organizations today, find that you have to have some kind of link because there has to be something that you've studied. And I think as a lot of the schools are recognizing that studying international business sitting in New York or San Francisco is a bit on the silly side. That's why going there and having the experience as a direct, relevant case study, working somewhere else, ends up helping so much more. That kind of differentiation, if you don't have the opportunity to work while you're in school, will help you. However, I'm a huge advocate because I did my undergraduate, graduate in 4 years and worked full time. Sometimes can be an overachiever myself, but doing that at the same time put me in a position to actually jump forward a couple of levels when I was hired. So I think work experience, any way you can get it to help you, really makes a big difference to differentiating yourself today.
Another question?
Yes. Hi. I work for a small. Nonprofit research organization. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about working internationally for the nonprofit, non-governmental sector, rather than just the corporate and governmental areas.
Do you want me?
Yeah, because Karen works for one.
I work for a nonprofit right now. Most of the places I've worked actually have been nonprofits, except for a big consulting firm and then a law firm. They've all been nonprofits. It's certainly, I don't know how it is in the corporate side. I mean, everything that Stacie said applies certainly to the nonprofit world, especially now because you know, at least finally people are paying attention a little bit to the environment and the problems we have. So the amount of, you know, offices that exist in terms of nonprofits across the world, the projects that exist, even companies also doing projects in other countries in terms of development assistance projects are growing. So the opportunities are certainly there. The only one thing I would say in the nonprofit world, and I kind of, you know, bemoan this because my husband works for a for-profit, is, you know, the kind of conditions under which you work and travel overseas are certainly different. I mean, I don't, you know, did not travel. You know, I spent years working in Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova, flying economy class, staying in economy class hotels, you know, flying like Belavia Airlines. I mean, not, you know, and you know, it toughens you up. And if you're open to doing it, I mean, I think it's a great experience. So I think everything that's been said certainly applies. I mean, it's nothing different. The salary structures are different, obviously, lower. But the experience actually can be even far greater, just because, you know, for me, working in international field for a nonprofit, I think you get much more of, I'm not entirely sure compared to the corporate side, but I think you get actually more opportunities to work internationally if you're open to doing it. Just because, you know, it's a struggle to find people who are willing to live and work under certain conditions on projects that are, you know, a struggle every single day. And so I think there are far more opportunities out, and certainly now, than there were 10 years ago.
We have another question from the audience.
I want to ask how much support you received from your respective companies in terms of preparing you to go abroad, especially in language. Was it up to you to take initiative to learn the language and then propose a project, or did you receive training prior to going abroad?
I went to London, so I didn't need any training, except I needed to know what shagging was, definitely. I wish they had given me a couple of tip sheets about language, but.
And in the Foreign Service, of course, they do send you for language training, and you can't be tenured until you've reached a certain level of proficiency. So,
mine's a little bit different too, just because I was not born in the U.S. and I spoke other languages before I learned English. And so I did, when I was moving to Russia, though, the consulting firm I worked for did offer Russian conversation classes to get me up to speed, so I could do business there. But you know, even that's one thing with the language. I would say, like, my husband moved with me to Slovakia and did not speak a word of Slovak, and you know, can now get by. I mean, once you're in an environment on a daily basis, you know, if you take some classes there, you can really learn much more quickly than you could ever here in a classroom here.
I'd say, based on the research we did, that a majority of companies provided a little, but not that much. But that's a growing field right now for lots of consulting companies, actually, that are providing it and beginning to do it as employees return home as well. And for language, because this is a question I get actually often, is it important or is it not? 50-50 split. You don't have to have it to go. I didn't. I could get by in a taxi and order my favorite dim sum, but that was about it. I tried very hard to learn. And that paid off because my staff saw me every night from 8 to 9:30 with a tutor, you know, speaking in tones, and it was not a pretty sound. And so that pays off because you're either trying or if you learn, and there's one actually woman in our book who actually went to Russia not knowing any Russian at all. 5 years later, she was actually teaching in Russian international accounting, you know. So some people are amazing and can do those kinds of great things. So that's kind of a split. It depends on the company, the organization, and the type.
Could I just add one thing there, though? Other than language, I wish companies and organizations would do more in terms of cross-cultural training. I'm on the board of Meridian International here in Washington, and they do training programs for people going overseas. I never had that, and I wished I had had that before I went to Spain and before I went to England.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience, but those of you with other questions, we can definitely take them when we go up into the networking session. So can we take one more question from the audience, please?
My question is, would you ever recommend to someone to just go and see what happens? go to the country of their choice and see whether they can make the project of their dreams work right there.
I'd say yes, and there's a big chunk of that, of the women we interviewed actually that did it. And we're finding people do it more and more, I think now, especially with it being competitive to be sent. It takes a lot of guts, it takes a lot of courage, it takes a lot of really smart planning because you have no net with you. So you have to plan financially, you have to plan from a healthcare perspective. You have to really do a lot of research because you're on your own, but a lot of people did it, and the amazing stories and getting it on the ground on some things is tremendous. I've been told so often over the last few months that Central and South America, specifically Colombia, is where a lot of people are going now. They're going to Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and doing just that, and they're taking their chances. Many times it's people who have a little bit of experience, 15 years maybe under their belt, put some savings aside and want to just go see and go do it, as you said, and it's a tremendous, tremendous thing to do.
I think I'd have to add, as my State Department self, before you just go do it, you really should make sure that you understand what the rules are in the country that you're going to, because you don't want to wind up running afoul of something if you're there without the sponsorship of an international company or another agency.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank Stacie and our panelists and extend a big round of applause and thanks to the GW-CIBER and Women in International Trade. Please do join us upstairs for our little networking event and book signing. This is a great book, and I encourage you to buy it. Thank you very much for coming out this evening.